Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Adoption Dialogue, the program all about all things adoption, the joys, the challenges, and the many complexities. My name is Judith Alexis Craig, and I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm an adopted person, adoptive parent, therapist, and social worker. And I am joined by my co-host,
Sally Baffour. I'm an adopted parent and also an adoption consultant, and I'm speaking from London. Judith is speaking from
Canada.
And we have a guest all the way from Australia. She's Lynelle, and Lynelle is going to tell us all about herself.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning for you, this evening for some of us. Lynelle, we really appreciate it. Lynelle Long is the founding director of the InterCountry Adoptee Voices, and we are very excited to know that it is 25 in the making, which is absolutely incredible. So we just want to honor you and thank you so much for being with us today. And before we get into details about sort of ICAV and wanting to learn all about what you do, could you share a little bit about yourself and your background as an adopted person?
Where did it all begin? That's the point. Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Yes, I am born in Vietnam. I'm actually of Chinese descent. I was taken and flown from Vietnam in the war. We're talking early 70s before Operation Baby Lift. I was taken and flown from Vietnam to Australia by my prospective adoptive parent, and I was only a 5-month-old baby. So I grew up in Australia, rural, kind of regional areas on a dairy farm of all things. Must be the only Asian growing up on a dairy farm. And they had 4 biological children of their own. So that's a little bit about me.
So where do you come in line in the biological children?
I was in the middle.
Right
so
in the middle.
Too older, too younger.
Okay. And the thing is, how is it that they came to collect you? Had they already started the process in Australia? How did that happen?
This is prior to, any official Hague Convention on intercountry adoption processes. So back in the 70s, my generation that came out of Vietnam were the first en masse to be, brought out of a country and intercountry adopted into Australia. So my parents did what we call a private proxy adoption. They essentially hired a lawyer in Vietnam to act on their behalf. He did, and sourced me. And then they flew over to pick me up as a 5-month-old baby.
Where would you have been at that time before they got you? Were you in
I was kept by the lawyer. They had their own private creche. It was a totally private affair. I was kept in a creche with a small number. I think they had 6 to 8 other children, looked after by an old girl who was herself, I think she was an orphan as well. Whether I'm an orphan, I don't know. It's to be debated. But so they had their own private setup, and this was how a lot of intercountry adoptions were done in the early days prior to the Hague Convention, which is essentially why the Hague Convention came into being, was to try and prevent some of these practices from, flourishing as they did for so many years, where children were sourced privately.
Because on many levels, it actually wasn't really very much official, because the government in Vietnam would not have known about it. Because a very private arrangement, isn't it?
A very private arrangement, but the government did know, because the Immigration Department, remember, they are responsible in every birth country. So the lawyer did obtain a passport for me, which is the only document officially that I have to even indicate that I'm Vietnamese. And that passport got me out of the country and into Australia. So the lawyer did work with the government. Apparently, he was working for the South Vietnamese government. He was very close. He was obviously very wealthy, because he lived in District 1, which is where you live in Ho Chi Minh City if you're the wealthiest. So he had a lot of privilege, power, and connections. And I can imagine that is how he managed to get children like me out of the country and into foreign homes.
It would be interesting to know how a practice like that would be affected once the Hague Convention becomes implemented. It would be interesting. Do you have any idea how that would have been affected? That kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, part of my life work is actually, I now sit on the Hague Convention as an observer. I'm very involved with the work of the Hague in terms of feeding our lived experience into it to actually inform it. So today, Vietnam is a signatory of the Hague Convention. They do have to follow certain processes that are Hague compliant. So adoptions like mine would not be done in this era unless it's still done privately. And you've got to remember, with the Hague Convention, it's not the be-all and end-all for every country and all countries. you can still, as a citizen of any country, still privately go and do what my parents did and bypass the Hague Convention and privately bring yourself in a child if the processes in the birth country are as lax as they were in Vietnam to facilitate that. And the problem is today is that the adoptive countries, if they're a signatory of the Hague today, there could be some checks and balances in the immigration procedure, but not always very well, especially in America, because the immigration department doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of the Hague Convention requirements as a central authority. A lot of terminology I just used.
First of all, please explain the Hague Convention, because I think a lot of people would not understand it.
In 1993, the Hague Convention was formed. It was basically the countries coming together with all of the adoption experts at the time. A lot of them were adoptive parents who facilitated an overarching guideline that says if we're going to do intercountry adoption, these are the bare minimum standards that we want countries to follow. It was signed and agreed upon, and today in 2020, you have something around, I think it's 104 or 103 countries that are signatory to that. But essentially what it does is it establishes agreed process, agreed ways, and entities who are accredited or allowed or given authority to actually facilitate adoptions in a certain manner. The problem with the Hague Convention, though, is that it doesn't have any guard dog. So there's no international body that checks. Country A, you've signed to the Hague Convention, but are you actually following it? Are you actually implementing it? No, yes, nobody kind of monitors and patrols what happens with these countries. They just get to be called, I'm a Hague Convention country, but yet whether I do or don't follow the procedures and the guidelines, nobody looks into that. Process of the Hague Convention is that they meet every 5 years with all of those signatory countries to talk about the practical application and the issues. And so that's the one time that you can bring up stuff, which is why we as adoptees are involved in speaking there, because you want to try and influence the way that the practices are currently running. But, you know, because this is bare minimum, it's not at a great standard. So a lot of our human rights, such as the right to identity, is not maintained under the Hague Convention. And that is one of its biggest flaws. Not only the fact that it has no gate.
But I mean, that's work in progress, because I think that with people voices being heard about the importance of identity and how it impacts on a human being and their development, their whole life development, I think that it's going to get to a point where it'll be inevitable that that's incorporated into it.
Have you found that, Lynelle, that the voices of us as adopted people have had somewhat of a positive influence over the last few years that you've been involved?
Definitely it's had an influence, but it definitely hasn't produced the outcomes that we ideally want. You know, so upholding our right and our right to origins, to be able to not have barriers in place to that prevent us from, you know, doing a lifelong search for who am I? How did these people get me? How did all these people, you know, manage to do deals with lawyers, judges and whatever and facilitate my adoption when actually it meets the criteria for what we call illegal and illicit practices. You know, so The Hague is not perfect, and I've certainly done my best to try and influence, but it's a flawed mechanism to begin with because of the very fact that there is no policing and that there is no international legislation in place to prevent the worst parts of what happens.
So really it's down to individual, and a lot of it also
is, and it's up to the parents. It's up to the parents, and this is where a lot of parents, prospective parents particularly, don't understand what's involved, and they don't do the research on how does this really work, and do I really trust the Hague Convention procedure to ensure that my child is not illegally or illicitly obtained. And that's the problem we have, is that parents are not educating themselves.
I think also the fact that the people don't even know about the Hague Convention, and I think that's a starting point. Because a lot of people who are going to go into adoption, if they went through the adoption system in the way that we do here in England, they will hear about it. But then in other countries where they don't have systems in place that actually can uphold and support the Hague Convention, they're not likely to even know about it, you know.
That's right.
And I know quite a number of countries already that I can name who are signed up to the Hague Convention who don't have systems in place to follow it through, unfortunately.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you have countries like America who are outright, they're the biggest receiving country in the world, the biggest, you know, bringer of children in via intercountry adoption, and yet they're actively deporting them back decades later because they have not given in automatic citizenship because of the fact that a lot of parents have done private adoption where they've not followed procedure, and so the child is actually technically and legally not eligible for citizenship. Now, this is a huge failing in the US to address it.
This a few days ago, yeah. We talked about it.
Yeah, raising how important that is and how traumatic that is for folks to be sent back to their country of origin, not having any connections, not speaking.
Well, you've had people die, adoptee suicide. Philip Quay is the most well-known Korean adoptee who actually suicided after being deported because of the very lack of supports and the fact that you have no language, you have no cultural shared understanding of the very country you're born in, because we are so removed and so displaced that, you know, it's not like we're going home in any capacity. It's like we're going to a foreign land. Well, it's like you're putting us on another planet. Yeah. So it's cruel and it's inhumane.
Yeah.
And this means that whatever it is the parents have done doesn't qualify the child to apply for citizenship or for them to do it, even if they wanted to. And that's what you're saying. Is that what it is?
Absolutely.
My God, that is so cruel.
And in the worst cases, you have the children who've had awful adoptive family life and awful parents who treated them really badly, and so they've left home early or they've been forced out on the streets. But once they've lost that connection of trust that probably was never there anyway with their adoptive parent, they're then left to fend for themselves. So when they go and, you know, get themselves in trouble later on, you know, and they don't have the right documents, they get deported. You have to watch Blue Bayou on Netflix. It's an incredible film that actually quite accurately captures the life of intercountry adoptees in the worst case scenario of being deported. It's a
What's it again? Blue Bayou.
Blue Bayou. It's on Netflix. I can't remember the name of the director, but look it up.
I remember I saw it on Netflix and I thought as soon as I saw it, I definitely wanted to watch it, because I know it's not necessarily based on an exact true story, but I understand it.
It's based on consultation with quite a few of the adoptees in ICAV who are actively deported. I speak to those people still and keep in touch with them, and they do consult with and give a lot of input into that film. So it's not one person's story, it's actually a mixture of a number of them who lived this experience and who are still, you know, fighting to be brought back to America, which, you know, is just probably not going to happen for a long time because nobody cares. It's devastating. You know, these people, you got to remember, they've lived and raised their whole life in America. They've had children, they've had families. They're actively separated from them because they get deported, but the rest of the family stays in America. So this is a travesty that's, you know, and it, you know, and this is why I say there needs to be a watchdog. There needs to be an international independent body that actually monitors how governments are performing under the Hague Convention and calling them out when they're doing the wrong thing. They should be doing everything in their power to fix that loophole.
Well, we see the good thing here in England is that even if that was the case, we had a lawyer here who was explaining to us that we have legal structures in place that can be used creative, even if it's through immigration or even human rights, in order to get the person to stay. So when that situation arises and the person is about to be deported, other legal structures can be brought in to ensure that they stay. So clearly in America, they don't have that flexibility.
That's technically I could be deported, it could have been, because my adoption was not done properly. I didn't have any real paperwork. I did commit a crime when I was young. I actually shoplifted and got caught. But because Australia has got a law in place that gives automatic citizenship, regardless of whether my adoption was done Hague or pre-Hague, it gives me citizenship. So I've actually just last month received my Australian citizenship proof. So I actually am now, thank goodness, at 50. I actually now know, after 50 years of being in this country, I actually know that I am now a citizen of this country because
does it actually take that long to become a citizen? 50 years?
Mine was very complicated and I put off for many years applying for proof of citizenship, but I always knew that our law was there in place. I'd never tested it for my own situation until now. So yes, so countries need to do like what Australia's done and make sure that the law for adoptees, regardless of the way in which they were adopted, allows them to be granted automatic citizenship if their parents, you know, their parents need to follow the right processes to apply for that.
Because that also means that they'll then enjoy the safeguarding processes that exist in the country for all the other children. Because with this system that you're talking about, they're excluded from it. even though they're children,
Well,
they would
just
not
think of the
enjoy.
ones in America who aren't given citizenship. They can't get Social Security. They are so vulnerable. They can't even turn to the normal mechanisms for support in that society because they're not actually technically a citizen. So, yeah, adoptees are so vulnerable. And this one point on citizenship and deportation really highlights how in favour of adoption for the adoptive parents the whole Hague Convention and the laws are, but not in favour for the actual person that it's supposed to be about, the adoptee.
I think of the lack of control, right, that adopted people actually have in decision making, lack of power, like it's just given over. And then when it's not even done properly, when we were talking about it the other day, it's shocking to even have to say those words, that you didn't do the process properly and have legal citizenship for your child. It just blows my mind even still. I've known about it for many years, but I still think about them. And I just think, how could you do that? How could you allow your child that you're professing to love and you want this child so much and all the rest of it? How do you do that to your child and leave them vulnerable?
I've lived a very similar thing because my parents actually failed to adopt me for 16 years. They brought me here as a 5-month-old baby. They didn't do anything legally until I was 16, turning 17, when I wanted to drive a car and get a license, and I had no identity documents. So there are parents like that who, for all intents and purposes, have the right idea at the beginning, but just fail to understand the gravity of what they're actually participating in and fail to do the right thing.
Did they know to do it, or they did not know to do the right thing?
They knew to do it. They actually had advice from their adoption agency when they first brought me into the country. The adoption agency, I have the letter. It's written to them and says, you need to go to Slater and Gordon, the legal firm, and go and finalise her adoption. And they never did, for whatever reasons. They just claimed that they were busy raising 5 children.
This is where the problem begins, because, the adoptive parent is the adult and therefore has a bigger voice and they're heard. I mean, it is a very interesting situation where they treat the adopted child in an infantile way throughout their life. And I think that's where the issue comes, because what you're talking about is extremely serious. And I just wonder whether some of them are even aware that there's such a thing as adoption that needs to legalize the child and give the child the security and citizenship in the country that would give them safety.
Well, this is a really good point, and one that needs to be talked about more, and not many people talk about it, and that is the risk of country adoptions are dodgy. They do trafficking, they facilitate illegal adoptions. It is on the onus, it's the onus of the parents, it's their responsibility to make sure that the procedure they're going through is actually legitimate and actually the correct procedure. Because if they're just paying a ton of money to a lawyer and trusting whatever he says, which is what my parents did, they're getting absolutely not only ripped off, but also they're being taken for a fool, because that lawyer, many of the lawyers who facilitated our adoptions prior to the Hague, they did trafficking of children under the guise of, we're helping you as a lawyer. Blindly believe them.
Well, I think you also got to remember and also realize that the parents were also complicit. They
knew. That's what I'm saying. The parents, the onus is on them to hire the right professional, not just any lawyer, but to do their homework, investigate what is the Hague Convention, understand what makes a legal adoption versus an illegal or an illicit one, and to understand what they have to do in all the steps to ensure that their child has proper legal permanence in the adoptive country.
And the thing is that it would be lovely for us to talk to people about how it's done. The only thing is it's different in every country. So what would work here in England would not work in Canada, neither would it work in Australia.
Similar though, the processes. I mean, on a global scale, the processes are quite similar. Because that's the whole concept of the Hague Convention, is that it gives you an international standard of process.
Can you talk through the process that the people, and I'll tell you why I need you to talk through it, because we can't assume that people even have the knowledge to do that. And I'll tell you why I say this, because here in England, we had something called farming. We also had something called child shifting, where we had, Caribbean children who were brought in. They came into the system to their parents. A lot of the parents didn't even know what they had to do to give those children citizenship. You have the same thing with Nigerian parents who brought their kids out with one called farming, and they genuinely did not know what to do. And I think that what we're using this program to do is to help people to understand that if you don't know where to get that information, we will tell you. some of the steps that you have to take fundamentally, even if it's the point at which you start searching for that information. So then they'll tell us from the Hague Convention perspective exactly how.
Every country has what we call a central authority who has signed up to the Hague Convention. Their role is to oversee and monitor and be responsible for the whole process of intercountry adoption in their country. So you're in the UK, you're in Canada, I'm in Australia. We each of us have a central authority. They are the first point of call that I recommend every adoptive parent go to make contact with their central authority. That central authority, in whether they be divided into states or provinces or whatever jurisdictions they all have education that is mandatory for their prospective parents. Those parents need to go through that. So if you've got a parent who is making contact direct with the birth country, whether they go and live there for a certain amount of time or whether they're, hiring a lawyer like my parents did, if they're not connecting to their central authority and being educated on intercountry adoption processes and the role that the central authorities play and what to look out for, then they're completely putting themselves at risk for doing what we call a private that is usually full of illegal and illicit practices that will result in a child having questionable, citizenship or whatever. And that's why you see occasionally in the news, you'll see these articles written by parents who have done exactly that. They've gone and done a private adoption. They come back to Canada or the UK and they make a whole of this hubbub about why the UK government or the Canadian government is not allowing their child to come in. Well, it's because those governments are actually educated themselves now and they know they've signed up to the Hague Convention and they're trying to stop those kind of adoptions from happening. They're actually doing us a good service. They're doing a role that is highly, highly needed in a market that used to be highly unregulated and very privatized. So that's the role of the central authorities. So prospective parents, they all need to be making contact with their central authority in their home country. And if they are doing an adoption domestically, well, I would be saying red flags waving, because domestic, there's not as much checks and balances that you are made to go through compared to intercountry adoption, proper Hague Convention process. There is a reason why people say that the Hague Convention has curtailed the numbers of children being sent abroad in intercountry adoption. And that is because country by country, as they're signing up to the Hague Convention, actually educating themselves about what is required to prevent these very same historic practices that result in illegal and illicit adoptions. They're trying to stop that after seeing it for 7 decades, having been a practice that's led to too many problems. Yeah. So that's my answer in a nutshell. Go and educate yourselves and make contact with your central authority.
So thank you so much for sharing that, because I think the onus does lie on the prospective adoptive parent, and knowing where to go is key. So we'll also just note that in our show notes that people need to check out their central authority so people can go there.
I can send you a link for every central authority contact because it's listed on the Hague Convention website.
Fantastic. Thank you.
That would be very helpful, actually.
And the other message that should go with that is, big warning, if your country has not signed up to the Hague Convention and you're considering adopting from there, you can guarantee you'll be most likely prone to be dealing with illicit and illegal practices. Because if they have not implemented those very basic safeguards and learnt from the decades of illegal adoption, you're putting yourself in huge risk.
But not only that, that means also that the child that you're bringing into a country like UK, for instance, will not be able to fulfill the criteria to be adopted and to become a citizen in this country. It means that the child you're going to bring in, you're going to set up problems with the child and yourself.
Yes, for life.
Yeah. And I think the key here too is that a lot of people feel like, for example, Auntie Sally being born in Ghana, for you to go back to Ghana and say, I'm going to adopt a child from Ghana, either a family member or, a child known to me. A lot of families will think they can do that there. They'll adopt the child, like you were saying, in their country of origin and think it's easy peasy to bring them back to my current country that I'm living in. And that is, I've seen it working in this field for, many years now. I've seen that happen, and parents are frustrated, they're angry, they're upset, of course, because you expect this child to come back with you.
So they think the Canadian government's their enemy. They think they're stopping them from giving a home to this child. But the Canadian government or the UK government are actually doing what is required now to prevent human trafficking. You know, every parent should educate themselves on the connection with intercountry adoption and human trafficking. And look now at the fact that the UN has just released their joint statement on illegal intercountry adoption and the problems that that has caused. So we have a lot of the work that I've done over many years has resulted in the UN's joint statement being published a year ago. And we just did an anniversary event in September this year. So this stuff is real. This stuff is not just one or two cases. You know, this stuff is across the board in every birth country we've come from. It is, in my judgment and experience and knowing very deeply what constitutes an illegal or an illicit adoption, I would argue that at least 80% of our intercountry adoptions around the world are highly illicit and illegal, if not outright illegal.
You know, that's just so alarming to look at those proportions. But alarming for me, for the person, the insecurity that it leaves a child in, even as an adult. That's my main worry. And as you said, a person can be stripped away from their family, deported, the family left behind in America or wherever it is, you know.
Well, you've got the biggest country now, Korea, South Korea, doing the first major investigation en masse of what's happened. They are the biggest sending country in the world, and they are finally now doing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which 386 plus cases of Korean adoptees sent around to, I think, 16 adoptive countries are actually being investigated. And what they have shown is that out of those 380 plus cases, not one does not fit the criteria for an illegal and illicit adoption. That backs up what I've been saying. I say it's 80%, but that's anecdotally, and I haven't done the actual research, but I know from all the thousands of adoptees who connect to me every year, I know that this is the ongoing story, especially we find out when we reunite with birth family. When we find out the story from the other end, we suddenly go, oh my God, that's not what was told to us. That's not what's in our paperwork. And, you know, we start to connect the dots.
So what's a typical situation? Was it a situation where the child was actually literally kidnapped from their parents? Typically.
That's not the typical one, but from certain countries that is typical, like Guatemala, like Sri Lanka. Some of those countries are known for those typical patterns. The most common story and experience is like what we call our forced adoption era. The mother was unwed, she got pregnant, she got placed in a maternity home. They basically influenced and coerced her to give up that child because there's no other way to help you. Therefore, this is the only way to solve the problem, and off the child gets shipped. And that is the biggest scenario for, you know, and yet our Western countries, country by country around the world, have declared that these are what we term forced adoption practices, and that we've apologized for, we've recognized as wrong, and yet we still allow the very same mechanism to be happening in inter-country adoption processes.
Interesting. But there's a great place for traffickers, because all they need to do is just persuade this poor woman that, look, you can't look after your child. Let's take the child off you so you can go and have your life. And the woman might still want her baby. And I'm sure that after the baby is gone, she might still want that child.
Well, usually you're told it's so shameful what you've done. You don't deserve to have this child. So it's that shaming of the mother. And that's the lack of options. Now, the Hague Convention, and especially the UNCRC, the United Nations Child's Rights Charter, of which the Hague Convention is embedded upon, the UN actually states that an inter-country adoption should be the last resort. In most of our cases for inter-country adoptees, our adoptions were actually the first resort. Those families, now I can guarantee they were never offered, would you like some food, shelter, clothing and money to help you in this emergency situation? None of those were offered. It's just, let's take your children, we'll give them a better life because it's so much better in Australia or America or Canada, and you'll get over it, you're fine.
You have other children.
And there's no support offered post
and there's no support offered after.
That's
right.
Of removing a child, or, you know, a parent not really wanting to relinquish a child. And I see it in the work I do is there are first or original birth parents who are in deep grief for decades, right, over this.
You can hear them on my videos that we produced for the United Nations first year anniversary. I have 3 videos from Ethiopia, South Korea and Uganda. Families speaking years later about what the consequences and the impacts are on them. Most of them, they say, they didn't even understand the legal concept of adoption. They did not understand that they were legally handing over guardianship forever to their child, and they had no right to that child. In often, many cases, like Uganda, they don't even have such a legal concept even in their country. And this is where the trickery, this is where the taking advantage of the vulnerable people is occurring by the mediators in the middle, the adoption agencies, the middlemen, the brokers, the lawyers, the facilitators. They are taking advantage of both ends, the birth mother or the birth family. I don't like to use the word birth, but biological. And then they're also taking advantage of the lack of the naivety of the adoptive families who are just thinking that I'm doing such a great thing to help some poor orphan. Well, hello, the majority of us are not even orphans. We often have at least one living member, if not a whole kin full of people still left. And yet they're not even being asked, would you like to look after this child or would you like to help them? So yeah, you can see a lot of the issues within this.
I think that the worry about this whole situation also is the fact that even the adoptive parents who are going through this don't actually get any training because they're not doing it in their own country. For instance, somebody who lives here who's going to adopt. In England, you will get the training because the system is such that you will have to go through the training, be approved here in order to become a prospective.
So an English person can still go to Guatemala, live there for 6 months or a year, adopt a child domestically, and then try and come back to England. They can still do that.
They can't do that very easily now because the system
it's not as easy, but it's still possible. Yeah,
it's possible, but it wouldn't work. The way the structure is right now, before that child goes into school, which a child has to go to school, they've got to produce all their papers. If their papers are not in order, it'll be picked up there and then.
Yeah, but what you're forgetting here is that the paperwork is very easy to fabricate. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of our adoptions, that the majority of our paperwork is fabricated. It's done in order to make the adoption look legal. And this is the problem that a lot of adoptive parents can't wrap their head around. Your adoption was done by a lawyer with legal processes, but it's technically what we would consider an illegal or an illicit adoption because of the fact that it does not meet the criteria to have been done where parents aren't coerced, where they have actually validated, was the child a true orphan? Were alternative options given to that family before any of this legal process even occurred? Was there even a legal mandated time frame at which the parents could change their mind? All of these standards that are written into the Hague Convention need to be followed, and there's a reason for that, because otherwise it's very easy to fabricate our paperwork and make it look like a mother relinquished her child. But the question is, who's checking and vetting that? And nobody is. False to believe that you're actually participating in something good if you're not educating yourself about the pitfalls and the huge ethical issues involved in all intercountry adoptions, whether they be via the Hague or whether they be via the non-Hague. Even following the Hague Convention process can still lead to adoptions being highly illegal. And we've seen that through our 7-8 year decades of history.
I think the most important message here is to let people know that they have to do a lot of the work themselves. I think that's the most important thing. A lot of these people are going in for the purely out of desperation because they desperately want to have a child, and so they'll do anything to have a child, and therefore that's what actually feeds this whole illicit adoption. Or trying to be altruistic. I want to just do a great thing. I'm going to be charitable, and bring a child in. I
think what we need to challenge them to do is to actually question the ethics of, first of all, fundamentally, there is no right for anybody to have a child, right? There is not a legal right that says, yes, you're allowed to go and obtain a child through any means possible. So what you're doing when you're participating in intercountry adoption is you're actually forgoing the child's rights, because as I said, every adoption that's done, our claim to our identity and our origins is foregone because we get replaced. Our identity gets replaced with a new one from our adoption. So my identity documents, until I undid my adoption legally, they actually state my adoptive parents as my birth parents. Now that is a legal it's a falsehood, right? This is where every adoption does not uphold our child's rights, human right to identity. We should know. And this is where surrogacy, donor conception, all very similar to intercountry adoption, but they all fail to uphold our universal right, as dictated by the UNCR, that we have a right to our origins, to know who we are biologically from. The fact that adoption replaces that and gives us a new identity is a testament to the fact that it obliterates our human right to origins to begin with. So every prospective adoptive parent needs to understand these basics of what they're participating when they go and get themselves a child. They're not just getting themselves a child, they're actually being part of the very system that means that we are wiped out for our identity. Our identity gets wiped by their action. Do they want that on their head, on their conscience?
I think that it's actually quite alarming when you put it in that kind of way.
Well, that's right.
It is alarming.
And it should be alarming. That's the
It is
point, is
alarming.
that too many people are not alarmed because they fail to even educate themselves on what they're participating in. You've now got 7 decades of adoptive parents worldwide who are going, holy shit, excuse my language, but they're going, dear, what have I done? Now that it's coming out country after country where they're showing that there is a huge amount of history with our adoptions being highly illegal, even though they were legally done, country after country is acknowledging it and starting to now recognize it. The United Nations has acknowledged it and has advised in their very statement about what countries should be doing to address it.
What are they advising?
Well, they're advising governments, firstly, that they need to put legislation in place so that you can actually prosecute the traffickers. Because to date, apart from the fact that the Hague is a toothless tiger and just sits there with no one monitoring it, you also have, on the global scale, there is a failure of legislation in every country to even term it illegal adoption and to allow prosecution of the traffic. The only prosecution that is occurring around the world that's allowed by legislation currently is the falsification of our paperwork. But that does not include and embrace the whole complexity of what actually happens to us when we get illegally adopted. It's only one part to have falsification of paperwork. What about all of the impacts for the rest of our lives? We can't even claim citizenship back to our birth country. I can't even claim to be a Vietnamese-born person because all of my identity got wiped out through my adoption. So there are many ongoing implications that people fail to think about.
So when did you discover that you were adopted?
Oh, I knew from as early as I could remember because I look so different. I mean, my family are white.
Were you aware that you look different? Because most people aren't aware of it until somebody pointed out to you.
I was aware I was different, I guess, because people always commented, treated me like this little doll, this little Asian doll. You know, they'd be touching me and coming up to me. And, you know, it's like I'm this novelty, especially when you consider I'm raised in a remote rural region where there's only white people and there's this one Asian child with his white family. It kind of stands out, right? So I knew from as early as day dot, because there was so much attention given to me about, wow, where's she from? How'd you get her? You know, all these questions I heard all my life.
Yeah.
Were you able to ask your parents about it and talk about it?
Not really. My parents were from that era of hugely being uneducated and no knowledge about any of this at all. So they were only ever told by social workers, love the child like your own and everything will be okay. There was nothing about teach your child about her race, her culture, her origin, help her fit in with people who look like her. You know, there was nothing about our identity development. There was nothing about the racism we'd face. There was nothing about even the fact that we might have questions. You know, it was just assumed that we were a blank slate and that everything would be okay because you imprint on that blank slate and they'll be fine. That's so false.
That's like your identity, as you said, just being completely
wiped out.
How did that impact? I mean, it's a bit of a silly question because of all the work you do now, but how did that impact you growing up, you know, from a young person into teenage years into your young adulthood?
Well, I internalized it all. I internalized the shame. I internalized the, you know, my family and my country were only ever demonized and talked about in a bad way. My mother, they always said she was probably a prostitute. I mean, they didn't even know her. But yet they said things like that because that was the sentiment that went around for all Asian women who gave up children, you know, coming out of Korea and Vietnam. So, you know, so I very much grew up with a huge sense of shame. I hated how I looked because it was always noted and picked on and, you know, I had a lot of racism. I did not fit in with that family. I was not treated well. I suffered years of abuse. So, you know, my adoption story is not one that's a rosy coloured glass, you know, kind of story. So it was always very difficult and I struggled. So by the time I reached 24, I was already suicidal. I had major depression. I had all sorts of problems, you know, and I was in a really bad way.
And I think also because you were alone, if you had had another person like you in there, perhaps that might have softened it a little bit. Maybe not.
It might have, but they had fostered Aboriginal children before me, and I even heard how they talked about them. They were a very racist family. You know, they were like the Aboriginals, they're good for nothing. You know, they're all lazy, they all drink beer, and they all just, you know, hopeless as parents and things like that. This was the way that my family talked. Even talking about Asians, they would be saying the Asians coming in and taking over the country, as if we were some invaders, you know, to be afraid of. So This is the context in which I was adopted. And Australia had just come out of a white Australia policy, an era where immigration was capped, where you were not allowed into this country if you were Asian.
Yeah.
But
So
that's the context of which I was adopted.
And you see, this is what we're trying to highlight on our program, to let people understand that the subliminal messages that children pick up can either make them or totally destroy them for life. Because, you know, and its impacts. I was talking to somebody 2 days ago, and I was just telling her that, because, you know, we're talking about transracial adoptions, you know, and I was saying to her that, yes, you might be walking with a white family or sister who's a white sister, and you walk into a shop, and the security guard there is following you immediately. So you tell your sister, look, the security guy is following me. She says, no, he's not. You say, yes, he is. But because the security guy isn't following her, she doesn't realize that it's happening. No. And so then she'll start thinking that you're being paranoid. That every time these things happen, so eventually you do become paranoid because you start believing that you are paranoid.
Well, you also internalize that and feel like there's something wrong with you.
Well, that's the point. And then until you meet other people, if you're lucky, and find that they also go through the same thing. But if you don't, then it actually develops into a mental health problem.
This is why it's so important to have peer support spaces, because it is so important for adoptees to be able to connect in with others who share the lived experience, who can validate and who can say, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. This is the power of peer support.
Yeah. And I think that's particularly the case with the country adopters, for sure, and transracial adopters as well, because that's a space they really need to talk, because they can't talk about. We had another young man who said that in his family, and I was thinking about it last night. He said, you know, he would actively not get involved in any family photographs. You know, now, why didn't somebody in the family say, hey, where's Paul? Where's Paul? But of course, he's become so invisible that they've all internalized his invisibility. And therefore, even when he's not around, nobody questions it. That's a worry.
That's very scary. How did you, Lynelle, I know we just have a few minutes, but I'm curious as to how you overcame your suicidal sort of ideation that you experienced, and what was sort of the impact. You spoke about peer support. Did you have that in your 20s? Was that later? And is that what led you to sort of develop ICAV?
Yes, I went looking for support and I found none, because none existed then. So that is why I created ICAV. Yes. And I have lived 25 years of seeing the results of what peer support can do in the community for others. I've had, you know, so many thousands of adoptees, you know, connected to me over these 25 years, and to watch them grow, watch them journey, watch them become active in the community. You know, it's been an absolute blessing to be able to witness and to be part of this growth that the adoptee community has gone through in 25 years that I've been involved. And by far, it's been one of the greatest healing things. For me, it was definitely doing years of intensive therapy, as well as side by side, connecting to all my peers and being able to turn my, you know, difficulties into something that helped others was just the best thing that I could have ever done to have changed my life. Yeah.
Kudos to you for even having the presence of mind. If you're going through suicidal thoughts, you're going through depression and all of those things, to be able to go through that and be able to set up what you did, that is commendable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, really. And also, when you look at the lives that have been impacted by it, a tremendous undertaking, and we really are very grateful, because I think also from your organization, even the Hague Convention is growing and becoming more knowledgeable. And I think what will make the greatest change is when they start having more adoptive people, InterCountry Adoptee peoples, as members and decision makers in the Hague Convention. That's what's going to make the difference.
Absolutely.
And I hope that day comes soon.
Well, I'm hoping to see, and this is what I've started at the UN, is that we start to get some biological parents' voices and family members' voices in there, because it is still largely, you know, their voices are so silenced, they are so not invited, they are so not even visible. We need to change that as the next phase of where this community goes, is to bring the voices of biological parents and families in on intercountry adoption discussions, policy, practice and legislation.
And I think the attitude of society needs to change, because I think that's also what's kept them silent, because of the shame. And if you're feeling ashamed, you feel that you're sidelined, and therefore you do want to be visible. So society's got to change, and we hope that we can do that through this program. You know, Lynelle, it's been brilliant talking to you, and we've got to bring you back again, because we haven't finished.
Well, I encourage you, if you want contact with some biological parents, they are now willing to speak.
Are
And
they
you
now?
know, being that you are people of color, they will probably feel more comfortable to speak with people of color. So I really encourage you to begin those conversations.
We desperately want to do so, and we need them.
Yeah, they've been threatened. You know, whenever they go seeking their children, they get barriers put up against them because, you know, they get told you don't have a right to even know where your child is, and you gave them up, you know, and yeah, so it's very difficult for them, and they often are still living in the same crisis situations that resulted in them giving us up in the first place.
Yeah, and
So,
have moved on.
yeah,
And have moved on.
they haven't moved on, and they don't have access to mental health support.
Yes, that's such a huge part. And we definitely want those voices. They're so important, and we have to honor that and make space so that we can start this healing process, you know, and there is healing that can be done, but there has to be support available too. And I think that's, you know, another arm. We don't have time to discuss it today, but you know, around support that can be offered and that should be offered automatically, right? Without financial barriers being put in place.
And I think that the only time that support will be given to them is when people hear what their story really is. And because they're not verbal and they don't speak, people don't have any conception of what they're going through. The minute we give them a voice and they start speaking, people are then going to become empathetic, and then we'll start opening the door towards getting the kind of that they need, you know. So, Lynelle, you know, let's do this together.
Absolutely. Thank you for what you're doing. It's such an honor to be on your program, and it is so necessary to educate people.
And it's an honor to have you. In your 25th anniversary just goes to show what you can do when you are determined and believe in what you're doing. You can move mountains. Lynelle, thank you so much for what you're doing in the world of adoption. And having gone to The Hague and got them to start moving in the right direction, we can't thank you enough. Kudos to you. Thank you so much.
Lovely to meet you, Auntie, and great to see you too, Judith. And thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you very much indeed for coming. Lovely. Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.